Happy Monday, and thank you so much for joining us for the latest in our equity series. My name is Josiah Gilliam. I am the My Brother's Keeper coordinator in Mayor Bill Peduto's office within the Office of Equity. And as you probably know, if you've looked at any of these broadcasts, we've been doing a series of conversations just to unpack this current moment, but also to explore the different areas of activity that happen within city government, both within the city and in partnership. And we had a conversation a couple weeks ago with the Department of City Planning. And this is the follow-up to that conversation where we're going to get a little bit more into the details, into specific programs and how it affects residents and neighbors and what the relevance is of this work right now. As normal, we have two ASL interpreters coming along for the ride today. We have Iris and Megan that you'll see at different times during the broadcast. We want to thank them for coming along with us today. And what I'll do without further ado is just get to a round of introductions so we can get into the meat of this conversation. There's a bunch of interesting terms, a bunch of interesting areas of work that'll be a lot of fun to explore with these folks. So let's get to it. Friends, what I'd like you to do, just your name and role, and then we'll get a little bit into what each of you do after that. We'll start with Director Andrew Dash.
Thank you, Josiah, and good afternoon. My name is Andrew Dash. I am the Director of the Department of City Planning.
Alrighty, thank you so much. Christopher?
Thanks, Josiah. I am Christopher Corbett. I am the neighborhood planner serving the East End of Pittsburgh and co-leading all citywide housing initiatives.
Thank you so much. Osei?
Good afternoon. My name is Osei Akinlotan, and I am neighborhood planner for the southeastern portion of the city, and I am leading equity work within our department.
Great. And Hillary?
Hey everybody, my name is Hillary Roman, and I am the Americans with Disabilities Act coordinator, better known as the ADA coordinator for the city of Pittsburgh.
Thank you so much. So Director Dash, let's start with you, man. Tee us up. We had a great conversation a couple of weeks ago. What are we here to talk about today, and why is it important?
Yeah, thanks again. So, just to repeat some of the things for those who didn't listen in a couple of weeks ago, the Department of City Planning is really focused around land use and the use of land and development in the city of Pittsburgh. And it's our job to be working with residents, to be working with community organizations, to be working with our other departments to develop policy, projects and programs, both at the neighborhood scale and the citywide scale, and to implement those policies through through compliance. So whether that's the boards and commissions that we see through our Zoning and Development Review Division, such as the Planning Commission, the Zoning Board of Adjustment, whether that is the work that our Public Art and Civic Design Division is doing around managing the city's art commission and working on the city's public art collection, whether that's our sustainability and resilience team that is leading the work that we're doing around the climate action plan, or whether that's our strategic planners, many of which Christopher, Osei, and Hillary are all part of. And that division really focuses on policy, so developing the city's zoning code, which is the regulations that we have around where buildings can go, how they can be built, and what types of things need to be there to support them, to larger planning efforts, which we'll talk about, that both affect the city and neighborhood scales. And so last time we were talking a lot around equity and public engagement and some of the improvements and things that the department's introduced to ensure greater equity in the planning process. And so today we're going to talk about some of the programs, so some of the outputs of that work, whether that is work that is going on around housing, starting with the city's Affordable Housing Task Force and moving forward, to the work that we have done relative to persons with disabilities and our work under the ADA, as well as a more recent program, the Registered Community Organization Program, RCO, and work that Osei will talk about relative to how we're ensuring racial equity through that process.
Terrific, thank you, Director. And I welcome the chance to speak with you all again, not just because you're interesting, but because it's a cool opportunity to take the conversation from what can often be an esoteric kind of conversation and down into the details and down into how this actually impacts people. Christopher, I'd like to turn to you. For those that maybe didn't catch the last broadcast, could you just summarize your role, what you're focused on, and then tell us what you have to share with us about today?
Yeah, thanks, Josiah. So last time we spoke, we talked about our neighborhood planning efforts, and some of the things that came from that call were equity and neighborhood planning. And we talked about on the East End, how the Homewood Plan was passed, how we're starting the visioning state study for both East Hills and Lincoln Leamington. And today I'll be talking to you about our citywide housing policies and how equity is a guiding principle when making policies. And I always say that I'm co-leading this effort because there are so many moving parts and authorities and departments that I am working with.
Perfect. Well, let's jump right in. Tell us about some of the housing programs, and I'm particularly interested, obviously, in this moment, this COVID moment too, like what all you have going on.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment to say the least, but as housing as we knew it actually changed in March and April. And when we realized that COVID-19 was going to be here a lot longer than any of us had expected. And so two things that I do want to touch upon as a direct response to COVID-19, that the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh is offering programs, and they have made operational changes to make sure that housing kind of stays the same for their residents, as well as the URA by partnering with the Urban League of the Greater Pittsburgh area to offer program assistance for renters, homeowners, and those of our residents who need utility relief, or assistance for utilities. And those talks can actually be seen on our city channel on YouTube. I believe it was posted on July 15th when you did the equity series for affordable housing. Coming up, what we do have and what we're working on now, from the Housing Opportunity Fund, which is housed under our URA division, is the stabilization program. The Housing Opportunity Fund was actually created out of work that we did with the housing needs assessment back in 2016 and 17. And so we had a affordable housing task force created from that study. And basically it identified that individuals needed more avenues or pathways to home ownership. And so the City of Pittsburgh actually committed to about $10 million over 12 years to invest in different funds and incentives for homeowners. One that comes to mind is the down payment and closing cost assistance offered by the Housing Opportunity Fund, where it assists first-time home buyers with down payment and closing cost assistance, which we understand that can be a burden to owning a home. And though we understand that homeownership isn't for everyone, is kind of working with different nonprofits throughout the city and incorporating those to make sure that we have some type of avenue for home ownership. Rental assistance is also given, and as I stated earlier, the Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh too.
That's terrific. And so is it the case that, are there experiences for folks to learn more about these resources, or is it a kind of find it online kind of deal?
Yeah, so both the Housing Authority and the URA has their website, and they actually list contacts, and anyone who's curious about the programs that either authority offer, I feel free to check out their websites and take a look and call someone. Usually they have a contact, and they're more than welcome to call and get more information about those programs.
Terrific. Tell us about, and want to shout out our teammate Molly, who does a great job with making sure that the chats are linked up with these resources for folks. And we do encourage people to do a deeper dive with those materials as they're shared. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with inclusionary zoning and Lawrenceville United in particular.
Yeah, so this is exciting. Inclusionary zoning actually came out of the housing needs assessment that was done in 2015. And the Affordable Housing Task Force actually promoted this and said there's a need for inclusionary housing and zoning. So what we did, we partnered with the Lawrenceville United, an organization in Lawrenceville, to seek opportunities to create more permanent affordability in our housing stock. The reason this is so important to do so, and when we did the housing needs assessment, it was identified that we were missing about 20,000 housing units to close the gap for affordability. And so working with Lawrenceville United and creating an inclusionary zoning district or overlay actually promotes permanent affordability and permanent housing. And so that is something that has been in the works for quite some time. We are happy to continue those conversations with Lawrenceville United, and we are currently in the process of making that more of a permanent overlay district with the group in place in Lawrenceville. This is important to look at from a citywide perspective because what we want to do is actually get ahead of any growth that's happening in our city. And so one way to do that and make sure that people aren't displaced, inclusionary zoning will be that tool, if you will.
Can you just differentiate a little bit why this is such an interesting innovation given how things go normally? Like how does a city normally think about zoning? And then why take this move in partnership, of course?
Yeah, that's really an interesting question because a lot of cities kind of wait until it's too late, right? And so what Pittsburgh we're doing is trying to get ahead of it and doing while we're getting development. So development is happening in Lawrenceville, ways to kind of eliminate displacement and create more opportunity for home ownership in such a dense area and such an area that is experiencing so much growth and development. Inclusionary zoning will be it. And so we'll take a look, and right now it's a pilot program, if you will, and so we're taking a look at how it's working, creating best practices and looking to other cities too as like case studies, and really listening to residents who are benefiting from it before we even think of extending it to other neighborhoods. But again, that is something that different neighborhoods are kind of experiencing from a nonprofit, but not from this, from our department. So we have a nonprofit in Oakland, for example, doing a land trust. City of Bridges is another one. And the inclusionary zoning is similar to both nonprofits.
Thanks for that. Director Dash, I wonder what you think about this. This is an exciting idea for the future, in your opinion?
It is. And so I think when the Affordable Housing Task Force came up with the numbers and let us know that there was such a gap for affordability in the city, we knew that we had to try to tackle the problem in multiple different ways. And so Christopher talked about the work that the Urban Redevelopment Authority has done with the Housing Opportunity Fund. There's been a lot of discussion around things, like the 9%, tax credits and things to develop affordable housing that the city can try to move forward on. But also what inclusionary zoning does is it affects the private market, and it has the private market help us in trying to develop additional affordable units for our residents. And so each one of these things is not something that can take on the problem by itself, but they're all pieces to how we can try to encourage more affordability and more affordable units in developments as development is coming to the city of Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it seems like additional tools, so to speak, to help with this. I imagine things are in a bit of flux because of COVID. I'm wondering if folks wanted to do some research. Are there other cities that come to mind that have taken an innovative approach like this?
There are hundreds of cities across the country that have used inclusionary zoning as a tool to provide additional affordability. We've been able to base our work on a lot of those best practices. We also, as we were moving through The Affordable Housing Task Force worked with the nonprofit, the Grounded Solutions Network, which also does a lot of assistance for inclusionary zoning and affordable housing issues.
Terrific, thank you so much. Christopher, was there anything else you wanted to share about the housing needs assessment? It's interesting that that having been completed, it's giving these numbers. Is this like an ongoing process, or what would you share with folks about it beyond what you said?
Yeah, so I'm happy to share that sometime this week, we are releasing a solicitation for an update to our housing needs assessment. And so we completed one in 2015, and when we're taking a look at it this time in 2020, since again, housing as we knew it changed, we're taking a look at a 2-year recovery plan from COVID-19 and taking a look at all the programs that we have in place now, and then how do we take a look at our housing needs for the next 2 years and then to 2040. And so the housing needs assessment is a tool definitely to be used or utilized to really promote equitable growth, ways to get in front of development and work with development, to Director Dash point, to really utilize the private market. And when we are creating or developing properties, we definitely want to make sure that they are affordable and that every Pittsburgher who chooses to have an opportunity to live in a safe environment, healthy environment, and quality environment too.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much. All right, Ose, I'd like to turn to you. For those that maybe didn't catch the last broadcast, would you mind summarizing your role again, and then share what you have for us today?
Sure. Again, my name is Ose Akinlotin, and I am the neighborhood planner for the southeastern portion of the city. So that includes Squirrel Hill, down inclusive of the 31st Ward, as well as working on the Greater Hill District Master Plan, or assisting with the planner there as well, Derek Dawson, and then working on equity projects within the Department of City Planning. And on the last call, of course, we were discussing equity within neighborhood planning, as Christopher referenced, and I was more so discussing the Greater Hazelwood Neighborhood Plan, just because of things surrounding that plan, because of its role prior to certain policy documents, such as the Neighborhood Plan Guide, the Public Engagement Guide, things of that nature. And then today I will be discussing those or referencing them just a little bit, just because of the equality related to those documents, transitioning that into registered community organizations and the equity assessment related to that.
Okay, terrific. So where should we begin? Should we begin with the RCOs, or just this idea of equity through the lens of programming?
Sure. Let's begin with equity as it relates to programming.
Right. So
discussing that, let's first say equality versus equity. And as I was stating last time, so these policy documents, the Neighborhood Plan Guide, which has 3 components. The Neighborhood Plan Guide outlines, or it brings equality to how we plan, to how we do neighborhood planning. And within that, there are 3 different components, and that is the registered community organizations, which I will be discussing today, as well as the Public Engagement Guide, which we went into depth on our last call, and the Planning Education Series. And more information should be available below. But for the registered community organizations, and outlined within that guide, pardon me, let me backtrack a little bit. Outlined within that guide, the Neighborhood Plan Guide, there are 4 chapters that are the community development, mobility, and infrastructure. And again, like I said, it's bringing equality to that process. And again, in most cases, people use the terms equality and and equity interchangeably. And I want to ensure that we are saying that the neighborhood plan guide is bringing equality to that process, but how we utilize this document and how we work with these communities ensures that there is equity within this process. Again, the registered community organization, which I will be focusing on today, just because of the type of assessments that we will be doing moving forward. Again, like for the equity team within the department, which Hillary is a part of, we are utilizing a quantitative as well as qualitative approach to assessing this. Just because we understand that there are numbers, and most times you hear of, and I know this is, sorry to say it like this, but most times it's like a black or white Pittsburgh, and there of course is like this systemic issue or related to planning, and these biases that come along with it. However, like we are looking at a broader approach, and we want to ensure that these things are mitigated, or these issues are mitigated. And along with this, there are capacity issues, and ensuring that these development issues related to the framework that is the registered community organization process, because you have to be a 501c3, and ensuring that that is not a barrier to entry as it relates to making sure that they are integrated into this development process. And that has not really been a problem. However, if you are not a registered community organization, you are not insured a meeting. Like zoning will notify you previously, but you are not required to, as a developer, notify these organizations. But that is not a barrier. Like we want to ensure that that is not a barrier to entry, and that they are meeting with all of these communities, and that everyone has a voice and everyone is at the table related to, regardless of any issues or any organizational structure or anything like that, and asking those hard questions related to your organizations and making sure you have the capacity. And that is all I have to say to that. Sorry.
Great. So a couple clarifying questions. So you mentioned this idea of equality versus equity, and then having a voice in the process. That tracks to me to my understanding of equity. I remember being in the nonprofit space when I first encountered the registered community organization idea, and there was some confusion around it, because it seemed to be like, so who gets to be that, right? What you're saying is that to be an RCO, you have to be a 501c3, and that they are in essence deputized, or there's kind of a systemic reality imposed where the developers have to speak with this RCO. But then there's an encouragement for them to engage broadly in the community with other nonprofits, community groups, and community leaders. But the RCO kind of provides this understood conduit for that kind of back and forth. Am I off track there?
Yes, absolutely. You should be engaging with the community anyway, and as neighborhood planners, we encourage that as we engage with certain developers, and we can all attest to that. Mm-hmm. However, as a registered community organization with the city, you are required to do so. But again, that is a barrier that in most cases need to be mitigated. And how we address those issues, and I don't know if Christopher, you would want to attest to that, or Director Dash, if you would want to, if you have any follow-up related to that. Sorry.
Sure. So, I think that, the way that the Registered Community Organization Program was set up was, I think that there is an understanding that in community engagement, a lot of times the city reaches out to neighborhood organizations. There was an understanding that the system, and who we interact with at community organizations generally skewed whiter, it skewed more towards homeowners, it skewed higher income than our demographics as a whole. And I think so we set up the Registered Community Organization Program to really try to create those ground rules for these organizations to make sure that they were, reaching out to the entirety of their community, that the involvement that they were doing as organizations was really trying to bring representative, slice of the population of these neighborhoods. And that in exchange for that, what we were going to do was bring developers to them, to have the public process happen in the community, as well as before, the only thing that was required was that public hearing happened downtown. And then the other side of that was that we wanted to marry this with the neighborhood planning program, so that we were doing neighborhood plans in those places and giving those communities neighborhood plans if they were, like I said, meeting those kind of basic requirements. And so, the work that we've got right now is, out of the 24 registered community organizations that we have across the city, the majority of those are unstaffed organizations. So they are resident-driven organizations. So 15 of those are unstaffed resident-driven organizations. And, and part of Jose's work and part of the work that she's doing is one of the things that is that only 7 of those 24 are in minority majority communities, in essentially Black communities in Pittsburgh. And so really trying to take a look at that and seeing, all right, well, why is that? And are there things that we as the city can do to make sure that there's more equitable voice in the engagement that we're having with our communities?
Thank you. That's useful. So Jose, would you say that how do you engage with these organizations? Do you encourage them to do their own kind of outreach? I mean, if there's one that's an unstaffed organization, the implication to me is that this is largely, community folks that have gotten together to form this RCO. I could be mistaken there. But given that there are likely, even in these communities that are led by RCOs of color, other organizations, nonprofits, leaders, et cetera, how do you encourage them to interact with their community?
So basically, of course, like within the public engagement guide, we encourage them to utilize the public engagement guide, of course. And then there are different tools within that public engagement guide, of course, communication strategy, so on and so forth. But of course, like many people, they have these hands-on approach. They know how to engage members of their communities, and we do not, what are those like old school approaches? People to people. Those type of approaches are best within these type of community. And we encourage that. And we ourselves attempt to utilize that as well, meeting people where they are. Yeah. And of course, just encouraging them to utilize these communication strategies to better understand and meet them, especially during COVID, just because we cannot meet them where they are or have as much face-to-face interaction. And again, that is in most cases a barrier to entry during this time.
And so there's an equity assessment going on with these RCOs. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, so that'll be going live pretty soon through Engage PGH. There you go. So look for it. Again, the equity team is in the finalizing stages of developing that based in RCOs, non-RCOs, just trying to especially get those polarized communities that are most likely, because in most cases it's Black or white when we discuss race within Pittsburgh. But of course, just trying to get those other populations, the immigrant populations, the LGBTQ plus population, the accessible handicap, sorry, not handicap, I apologize, Hillary, corrects me, unmute yourself and corrects me, there you go. Population as well. Yeah. And just making sure that we can meet people again where they are and addressing these barriers to entry. There you go.
Yeah, no, it's a great place to explore those ideas, right? How can you use this engagement to include or to improve communication? And then how are folks able to be intentional about reaching out to folks outside of their own circle, recognizing the reality of intersectionality and the unique opportunity to engage people in this process? To your point, there might still be barriers that we're working on, but there have been barriers in the past. And even something like Director Dash mentioned where there might have been this expectation or guideline that there had to be a meeting, but it was downtown. Well, that's not very accessible to a lot of folks of different abilities, but also just of different work patterns. And so to the extent you can engage people in conversation and in community around this, and that's what this seems really well set up to do. Before I turn to Hillary, I'd like to ask about just your thoughts, Jose, on the role of race and intersectionality in planning. We've talked a little bit about it already, even just what you shared, but there's a lot of conversation right now around this idea of justice and this idea of acknowledging and repairing the history of society and certainly just community here in Pittsburgh. Where does your mind go with those topics, and what would you share with us about it?
Sure. So immediately I think of restorative justice. And to me, like that is not something that, of course, me personally, I am not able to do. And as working for the city of Pittsburgh, like that is a broader idea that we as a community need to focus on. I am not going to pinpoint one person, but that is something that needs to happen. That is something that needs to be addressed. That is something that needs to be addressed. That intersectionality, like, of course, race is a major topic. And again, during COVID, there was something that came to the forefront that was beyond Black or white here in Pittsburgh that needed to be addressed. As a woman of color, as a Black woman, of course, that was a major issue for me. And I'm not going to, this is a personal aside here, but of course I see it, and it needs to be addressed. And there are systemic issues, not only here within Pittsburgh, but the US. There are policy issues that need to be addressed that stem from top to bottom. And we are slowly trying to chip away at these issues and these policies that we are trying to build and trying to instill in our daily work, is attempting to make some type of restoration towards that. However, it is a larger issue that needs to be mitigated by us as a whole, us as a people, us as a human race. But that is something that needs to be on the forefront of our mind as planners. And I think as we plan, especially because that is something like, as Christopher, that is something that he was discussing earlier, these populations that we need to deal with. And then, of course, like I was saying, the polarized populations here within Pittsburgh, because again, it's either Black or white, but there are polarized populations here within Pittsburgh that need to be addressed, these immigrant populations, the LGBTQ, queer, however we should and properly need to address them. And then, of course, the accessibility of our city, which Hillary will be addressing in the next few minutes. These are major issues that restoratively need to be addressed. And we do address this as planners. These are at the forefront of everything we do moving forward. And you can see that as we develop these policy documents, as the neighborhood plan guide, as we have these different policy experts, as Hillary, as Domi, within how we plan moving forward. And again, that's what I was saying about these equality moving forward as we plan for not only our neighborhoods, but as our city as a whole with our comprehensive planning, and then having that equity in place moving forward. Thank you.
I do want to turn to Hillary to get into more of what she does. I wondered are you hopeful about this? Is this a time for folks to lean in? I hear, and you guys have pointed to so many examples of where just the Department of City Planning alone has moved in this direction. There are newer tools, there are newer policies implemented. There's encouragement for folks to engage, and also philosophy about meeting people where they're at. All of these are things that you could say represent a different approach maybe from times past, and represent more access and innovation over time in the direction of people's benefit, to reach them where they're at, but also to engage with them in ways that make sense for them. When you think about this and the work that you do, Jose, Is this a time for folks to lean in? Are you encouraged by what you see, and would you encourage people to join you in that?
Absolutely. Use your platform. Definitely lean in.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Hillary, thank you so much for chilling patiently. I'd like for you to just take the floor here and describe for folks what it is that you do and your role within the city.
Sure, absolutely. And just quick, like access wise, let me know if, I think my mic might be a little bit low, so let me know if I'm talking quietly. But what I do for the city is, as the ADA coordinator, is my work focuses on the second title of the ADA, and I'm not going to go through all the titles of the ADA, but it's important that people understand that my work is specifically focused on making sure that Title II compliance is enforced. And what that means is that the city's programs, services, and activities that we offer are accessible. So it basically encompasses everything. It can look like a lot of different things, and we'll get into that. But you know, one example that you can see right now is our ASL interpreters. That's one of the things that I do to make sure that's in place.
So let's start with a couple high-level definitions, if we could. If you were to picture addressing a group of high school kids, how would you describe what the ADA is? And then how would you describe what the idea of compliance is relative to that?
Sure. So the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed into law in 1990. So it's crazy that it's not actually that old. There were a number of protective laws before that. The Rehabilitation Act, it's a civil rights law. And so at first, you know, disability was explicitly not, it wasn't addressed, or it wasn't addressed explicitly, I guess is a better way of saying that. And so essentially the ADA is a very special law because it's the first law that really explicitly states, like, this is for you. This is to make sure that everybody with a disability we make sure that we can get them the access that they need and that they deserve. And so that's really like the broadest way that I can put it. But it really, it touches everything. It can look like, you know, it's like you said, what I do is basically compliance, you know, and that's true, but we try to expand that to making things more inclusive. Because there's definitely a difference between that. You can be completely compliant without being inclusive.
Sure. So I want to get into that balance. Let's start with the term disability. This is something that's in the name, it's in the term itself. It's also something that I have heard used with a certain stigma attached, but it's also a term that I've heard used in what I would say is in a restorative sense, and like a claiming of this term with appropriate definition. So language is very important for the work that you do. What would you tell us about the term disability before we get into the compliance and accessibility?
People with disabilities are just like any other group of people, not a monolith. And so I can't, speak for everyone, but I can tell you the history of how we've come to think about it. The main most important thing, best practices for everyone, is person first language. So you wouldn't want, it's basically saying like a person who's disabled, but then other communities, it can be confusing because some people prefer to be called, a deaf person, not a person who is deaf. And so it can be a little bit confusing, but the heart of it is maybe just the most important thing to remember is that you're defining a person by their humanity and not by their disability. So that's kind of like the easiest heuristic I can use for people. There is a strong movement to reclaim and accept the term disability, which is what you were referencing. What I've seen is it can sometimes be sort of considered condescending by certain groups of people with disabilities to call them, differently abled, for example. And I think there's an understanding that that's meant with the best of intentions, but it can kind of seemingly imply that disability is something to be euphemized or something to be ashamed of. And so that's kind of why there has been that reclaiming among many people in disability communities to just really accept the term disability and change the meaning of it's not a negative thing. It's not something that needs to be euphemized.
So this is also an area where that term applies to a much broader swath of people than people might originally think. And isn't it the case that all of us at some point have or will experience some form of disability? Is that a fair thing to say?
Yes. So people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the United States. People will sort of vary between 1 in 4 people has a disability at any given time, 1 in 5, but essentially everyone will experience disability at some point in their lives. It will touch you or somebody that you love. And so one of the unfortunate things that I face a lot, that I deal with a lot, is people sometimes have a hard time imagining what it would be like to have a disability, and then they have one, and then they can't believe how hard it is to do stuff. And so the hope is that, you know, through like the coalitional values that I have, you know, with my colleagues, and like I'm seeing in the wider activism movement, is that, you know, people are speaking up for each other. You know, people in BIPOC communities and LGBTQ plus communities, and, you know, the activist community is starting to get back to that 70s vibe of like, you know, we don't need to experience what you're experiencing to speak up for you, to have empathy, to try to learn from you and do better.
And yet I hear your caution about being intentional with the words that we're using people first language, because there seems to be a tendency in this space, to the extent that I've encountered it, of even unintentional othering that can be damaging and indeed violent. So I'd like to get back to your idea of inclusivity versus compliance, because it would seem that on its face, this idea of using people first language, of respecting how people would prefer that you refer to them, and also advocating on their behalf, whether that's through advocacy or design, is all inclusion. But yet a lot of what you do has to do with compliance. So speak to us a little bit about that balance and how you think of the term compliance within this realm.
Sure. So an entity can be completely ADA compliant without doing anything. So essentially, that's not really true, but what I'm saying is, like, you could, instead of trying to start a program that's inclusive and designed for everybody who has every type of disability, you know, that's very difficult, and it can be overwhelming for people, and it can also induce liability, right? And so, like, if you're unwilling to make a program accessible for people, then you could be opening yourself up to be sued. And so a lot of times, you know, entities, you know, government entities will just not do it. And so that's compliant, but it's not inclusive. And so I kind of try to push people, and Director Dash could probably speak to this, I try to push, you know, people to take a little bit more risks, you know, and I think, you know, we will fail, but I think seeking out failures inevitably, because we can't think of everything. I mean, universal design is a term that we throw around, and we always are aiming for it, but it's pretty hard to have everything, you know, something that's completely universally designed for every single user. But I think the effort's important, and taking the risks are important. And so that's kind of the difference between compliance and inclusion, if that makes sense.
It does. Can you give us some examples of what compliance might mean in terms of like, let's just say city planning, since we have the team here on the call. So what are some common examples, or an example of where this comes to play?
Yeah, for me, being in city planning, and you know, the way that I interface with, and there are ADA coordinators for everything. You know, the airport has ADA coordinators, nonprofits have ADA coordinators, and so it can kind of look like a lot of things, but you know, it can sort of look like, one of the things that we hear a lot is that, you know, something was designed for them as sort of an afterthought. So it was designed for, you know, your able-bodied person, and this is where we get into ableism. And then there wasn't a door that, you know, was accessible. It had, you know, the type of handle where somebody who didn't have, you know, might have a certain type of disability, they couldn't turn the knob. And so then you have to get into going backwards and fixing it, and it kind of, you know, it just makes everything harder. And so that's kind of where you might encounter, for me, I tend to encounter it more in like infrastructure and traffic, and I don't tend to do as much like employment type stuff, but that's part of it too. Communications like this Zoom that we're having, somebody being able to access something in Braille, or getting an interpreter so that they can attend a public meeting, or making sure they have a parking spot. I mean, I could go on all day, but those are some of my main examples that I encounter.
And while you're in the Department of City Planning, you're a citywide resource, is that correct? So if folks had, say, my role is a blend of the Mayor's Office and Parks, say we wanted to do an activation, COVID safe, within the parks, and we had some questions around ADA implications, this is something that we as a City Parks team could reach out to you about?
Yep, I'm I'm here for the whole city. So yeah, I'm in city planning, and that's a really great place for me to be. It enables me to like touch a lot of things and touch a lot of policy, but also be connected to infrastructure. And so it's a unique place for me to be. But yeah, when people talk about government silos, I'm like, what silos? I'm all over the place, like, which is great because I've only been here for a year. My work anniversary is September 9th. And I've only been here for a year, and I've already had the opportunity to meet so many of our, colleagues and chiefs and directors. And, I have to, shout out to Director Dash, because he's definitely empowered me to just go forth and, learn what I need to learn and connect with who I need to connect with. And he's always very supportive in that regard.
Yeah, it's terrific. I find that it's the easiest to talk about silos from within them. And if you just take a different approach, you find ways to break those down pretty easily. Let's talk about ableism. This is a term that I've learned more about recently. How would you define it? Certainly something we could do a whole other conversation about specifically. But for the purposes of this conversation, what is the term there, and where does your mind go when you think of it?
Sure. Ableism is a form of discrimination that it's a form of discrimination against people with disabilities in the form of a preference for able-bodied people. That's like any definition of a type of discrimination sounds really intense, but most of the time, like most forms of discrimination, it's really not explicit, it's implicit. And it's kind of like what we were talking about, like the failure to design something with a person with a mobility challenge in mind. That's a form of ableism. And just basically not accounting for all users of systems, not accounting for what type of users will encounter a certain traffic system or a certain infrastructure system is, again, kind of how I interact with it. But like I said, a lot of times it mostly looks like, oh, I never noticed how hard this was until, I had this hip replacement, or, I lost a sensory ability or something like that. And so we're all guilty of ableism on some level, just like racism and sexism and, every other type of bad form of discrimination. And most of the time it's just about thinking, teaching ourselves and each other how to think about how would this look different if I didn't have, this capability, this physical or sensory or cognitive ability.
Got it. And it makes sense for a city to take that in mind increasingly over time. But there are disabilities beyond just physical ones. So I wonder how you might encourage folks to learn more about ableism and some of the other terms you've mentioned so that they can be just better neighbors and more empathetic with others.
Sure. So I would say, engage with people and don't be scared of it. I think people sometimes have a fear that they're going to do it wrong. And so I would say engage with, nonprofits, community groups. I'm sure you have, like I said, disability is so common. You probably have a neighbor or a friend who could use your help right now, and just ask them, certainly don't run up to somebody in a wheelchair and start pushing them. That's a no-no. But there are lots of ways you can interact personally, or, you can look at the ADA page on the city's website, and there are lots of links to, nonprofits and community organizations. But chances are any organization you join will have somebody with a disability in it. And so you can learn more by kind of just not being afraid to engage with it. But if you are looking for a specific way to engage, we have, information on the city's ADA page, and we have lots and lots of really active community groups here, which I'm so grateful for because they've taught me a lot.
Yeah, there are some really wonderful voices in the city on these issues specifically that speak from their own personal experience and do a great job of pointing to the realities of others in a thoughtful way. So something that folks can find very easily. I encourage you to do it. So Hillary, I understand that you have a bit of a debut for us. Can you tell us about the Disability Service Facilitator program? I don't have any kind of cool Zoom pyrotechnics for the first time something's being debuted on one of our series, but I am excited about it. So tell us what the deal is.
Yeah, so the idea behind it is, and I basically just ripped this off of New York City. So they use disability service facilitators too. And basically, the rationale for it is that the challenge of my work, which you touched on, is that, there's really only one of me, and the city is like 3,600 something employees. And so, that goes from, DOMI maintaining accessible routes, you know, with competing traffic needs, or you know, our innovation and performance department, how do they make sure everything we do online is accessible, or our communications are accessible, or our facilities, or like the mayor's office, how do we make inclusionary policies? And so the Disability Service Facilitator program is an attempt to kind of start to improve our holistic approach to how do we resolve this, and how do we kind of provide more of like a wraparound services type approach, so that, you know, if you needed something, if you needed an interpreter, you may not, you know, I might have 17 requests ahead of that. And so there's a person in each department who understands how their work interfaces with the ADA, and they can kind of take on some of those challenges and help to connect the gaps in service. And it was really, I was mostly inspired by the 30th anniversary of the ADA, which was just this past July. You know, I think we can always do more, and we recognize that there are gaps for people, you know, here in Pittsburgh with disabilities. And so we want to ensure, you know, more efficient and holistic service. And so, yeah, we've got a disability service facilitator in each department now. Well, almost. Like I said, it's a brand new baby, so we're getting there. But and then, you know, they'll go through a series of trainings and work with me, and kind of learn how they can kind of, you know, wrap their arms around this and figure out how to help me do the work and help the city do the work to better our services and programs.
That's terrific. It's great to hear about upskilling opportunities for our team members. Can you talk to us a little bit about the City County Task Force on Disabilities? I'm kind of cognizant in talking with you that this is a conversation centered on the city of Pittsburgh, but that this is not a city of Pittsburgh specific body of work or focus area. What can you talk to us about the regional efforts related to this and the task force in place?
Sure. So the CCTFD, the City County Task Force on Disabilities, is a 13-member body that is uniquely comprised of half city and half county, and then a 13th member. And they work together to kind of take on these initiatives. You know, there are things that both, it's hard to call the county an area, because if you're from the city, you're also from, you know, the county, but it's basically bringing perspectives that aren't just city focused to kind of talk about things that are coming up in their community, changes, things that they can address, how can they make a policy recommendation, you know, work with the city, work with the county. And I mean, they're an amazing group of advocates. It's an interesting setup because the county provides, you know, some of the funding for it, all the funding for it, and I provide the staffing for it. So a lot of times people will talk to me like I'm the leader of the CCTFD. I'm not. I'm just their staff. Like I'm basically just a liaison for them, and so, you know, I make sure that they're connected to whoever they need to be connected with in the city.
Got it. Thank you so much. All right, folks, I'd like to open it back up to everybody else. We'll find a place to land this conversation. I'm just wondering, now that you've heard the entirety of it, if what comes to mind or for you all in terms of what the future looks like and the future of the work that you all do.
Yeah, I think the future of the work that we're doing today is going to build a more inclusive Pittsburgh. I think listening today from OSE, from racial equity to Hillary ADA, and the work that I do in housing and how they're all kind of intersecting, and how I am always thinking about design standards for zoning and residential and commercial buildings that actually work hand in hand with the work that Hillary is doing for ADA. So how do we create design standards that make Pittsburgh more inclusive for our ADA community, inclusive housing for our LGBTQ, IA plus community. There's so many communities, and raised to Ose's point about how, you know, some of our federal regulations have kind of created housing insecurities in Black and Brown communities, and how do we kind of work to create solutions for inclusive housing and making more flexible zoning that actually promotes missing middle housing, and able to build smaller lots and more affordable housing too. So all of our work is kind of hand in hand together. And I think that if we continue to go with the leadership of Director Dash, who has been a champion for inclusivity, then Pittsburgh will be a more inclusive place.
Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, it sounds like, and just hearing this conversation alone, much less the one we had 2 weeks ago, that there is increasingly something for everybody. And I hear whether it's a general approach, programs, or specific lines of communication, there's an ability to meet people where they're at, and whether that's just general housing insecurity, providing pathways to home ownership, including conversations around development at the neighborhood level or the city level, and including your economic realities, your ability realities, your racial realities. And it seems like over time, we're able to do more for more people in a nuanced way. Instead of like this batch approach, it seems like we're really able to invest in a sense of community down to the individual level. I kind of wonder, Director Dash, kind of a similar question to what I asked Osei, like, are you optimistic about this era? Are you encouraged by what you're seeing? And do you think the future is bright for this work and for the city?
I think it is, and I mean, I think there are, we've discussed there are a lot of challenges out there, and we've been really trying to learn and continue to try to learn more about our city, both through the information that we're gathering, the stories that we hear from residents, and trying to translate that into policy change, and into making things, as the team here has stated, more inclusive, more equitable. And that, that we're truly trying to understand what it is that residents of the city of Pittsburgh want, and trying to respond to that. And so, and trying to respond to all segments of our community, not just the people that we traditionally hear from. Yeah.
Thank you all so very much. I feel impressed to just encourage people to learn more about this and to share with neighbors that you think might benefit from it. And not just with the Department of City Planning. We obviously have tremendous folks, intelligent, passionate, well-positioned folks in that department, but they mentioned the Housing Authority, they mentioned the URA. We have links in the chat where folks can learn more about these things. And whether it's COVID relief or housing insecurity or moving into home ownership or trying to figure out how to participate in this process in a general sense, or advocating on behalf of a neighbor that has an exceptionality or a different level of ability. There's something here in this time for you. And I think that could be a very hopeful message to folks in the midst of all this uncertainty. So I want to thank each of you for taking the time to have this conversation. I think the first time we've done so quickly another deeper dive with the team. Thank you so much for your patience and for your energy in making this happen. Please take, for those that are watching, look out for the next in our equity series. We're going to keep trying to find interesting conversations to bring you so that you can learn more about life here in the city, ways to get involved, resources that are available, and just general information. Until then, please take the very best care of yourselves, and we will see you next time. Thank you.